Welcome, everyone. It is Wednesday, July 7th, 2021, and it is Direct Line with Mark Unkerford, Don Irvine, and our special co-host, Jeffrey Thornton. And we are joined by China and human rights expert Ethan Gutmann. Welcome. Take it away, guys.
Well, thank you, and welcome back, Ethan. We were just offline talking about it. It was almost exactly a year ago that we had you on the show, and given how important China is, it was probably too long that we waited to have you back on again. I wanted to kind of kick off with a question. Of course, this is right now the period in which the Chinese communists are, well, celebrating is their word, but recognizing the 100th anniversary of the party. And I don't know if it's tied in, but it does seem to coincide with a considerably more aggressive posture on the part of the Chinese leadership this year. Is that an accurate perception? And then maybe we can kind of drill down on some of the developments.
I don't know that it's tied to the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. I do think there's no question about what you're saying. It's been a remarkably aggressive year. You look at what happened and what's happening in Hong Kong. It's a clean sweep. It's really, Hong Kong's kind of off the map now as a free, what used to be an oasis of freedom in Pacific Rim is gone. That's the wolf warrior diplomacy continues. The insults, the constant attacks. Now, most of that's for domestic consumption, Chinese domestic consumption. It's not really aimed at us at all. But we can see it works on, the World Health Organization very effectively. People kowtow to that.
So another area. Yeah, another area recently was, I don't know if it was the unveiling, but sort of the leak or the news accounts of sort of an invasion strategy for Taiwan. Now, it comes as no surprise that the People's Liberation Army has an invasion plan, and they wouldn't be generals if they didn't. But what's surprising is that it was, quote, released, and it's sort of a classic example of saber rattling.
Yeah, I guess I have two mixed feelings about that personally, and maybe you do too. On one hand, if you're serious about an invasion, you don't really leak the plans. Right. That's kind of. On the other hand, if you're, again, this stuff is for domestic consumption. It's to see how much support that gets. It's to prepare the Chinese people for an invasion. So that doesn't have to be the actual plan. It just has to say, we're serious about this. It's not even a message to Taiwan. There is no message to Taiwan. So much of what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, and I don't usually like to be the guy who says, oh, the poor Chinese Communist Party leadership feels so threatened. they're so threatened by so many things and they have to act this way. I don't buy that at all. I think they're extremely aggressive. I think they want world domination and all the rest of it. But in this last year, I've started to feel a little differently, that there is something really going on. Maybe it's just the built-up tension around this guy, Xi Jinping, who has dominated so completely, who's gotten rid of the sort of troika leadership, the idea that you always have three leaders and they're always sort of competitive and sort of together. That leadership by committee was a very stable arrangement. It's gone now. Xi Jinping is it. He's vanquished his enemies. And I think it's not terribly popular. This hasn't really been a great year for China, as much as they might want you to think it has been. I mean, the COVID thing is maybe they don't care about world public opinion polls, but I think they do, and they're disastrous, right? The Belt and Road Initiative has seen its first riots in Africa, where people have actually torn up facilities and so forth. That's new. This is a new creation, and the West is showing, with the exception of, say, New Zealand, the West is showing remarkable cooperation and resilience in putting together some sort of counter. It's slow, but it's there. And you can see that even in the fact that Congress has stayed, in spite of every other political difference, has stayed reasonably united on this question.
Right. There's some other China experts, authors have suggested that the Chinese had prior to this year, let's put it in the right time framework, that the Chinese long-term plan, if you will, for domination was exactly that, long-term, and that they were, quote, very patient, and they understood that they needed not to, stir the waters too much, to use that cliche, understanding that would have the opposite effect of getting their, potential opponents to coalesce in Asia and obviously the United States as well. So this aggressive posture kind of belies, undermines that thesis, because, as you said, it has had the effect of, by a more belligerent China has had the effect of making other countries that much more wary of them.
Yeah, that's right. And I was, I guess to my credit, I was one of the first people to say China was going in the wrong direction. That was back in 2000 and 2001, 2002. And I wrote a book about it at the time. But the fact is, I am as surprised as anyone. Okay. I really am. I did not, I keep thinking they're kidding, right? They've got to back off from this posture. This doesn't quite make sense. And they don't. And that's what's pretty disturbing, is this is a kind of chicken strategy, if you like, or maybe they simply, Xi Jinping has lost it. I don't know. I can't quite figure it out. Every time where I think this just doesn't make sense for them to continue, for example, with the Uyghurs and that kind of oppressing this group, or slamming Hong Kong as hard as they're doing it. And they do it every time. They pick the hard road. So I'm planning to go live in Taiwan, Taipei, and moving over there for 6 months in November. And I don't know. I mean, it's not exactly the safest lifeboat in the world right now.
Sure.
I'll probably be fine.
You'll probably be fine. We'll have you on, and we'll see, though, if the great censorship wall cuts us off when we try and put you on the air. You raised a very interesting point. I wanted to kind of raise that at the outset in responding, that it was for domestic consumption. Now, you got more conclusions to draw about the pushback, the problems they may be having domestically that would trigger something like this? We are getting so little information now. I mean, if you were thinking of us as like, it's like we were picking up stray radio signals. Now those are being cut off. So, for example, we used to have solid numbers about the number of labor incidents or riots every year, and they were going up quite dramatically. They were in the thousands, these incidents. And now we don't have those. We've been cut off from them, and the press doesn't get them either. And the press is too scared to sort of complain about this or ask about it. It just doesn't appear anymore. We were getting numbers about the Uyghurs, how many women were being sterilized, how many people were doing forced labor, these kinds of things. Those numbers have disappeared, of course. Okay, they're just gone, and which is why it's getting harder and harder to get that information on the ground. It's like we're looking at something so similar to the Soviet Union now. And of course, COVID, they've just cut off all Westerners from coming into the country. They've used that, and I don't believe they're doing it because of COVID. I believe it's an excuse for other reasons. Like many countries are using COVID, aside from England, which is they've just lost their minds over there in Westminster, but that's all right. Maybe they're coming. Maybe they're recovering now, but no, it's really a very strange phenomenon, because this is, of course, I predicted this to some extent, but I didn't really believe that they could close down a society which appeared at one time to be opening up very gradually, and they'd close it up so completely. And it's been such a slow process that we haven't noticed it. It's been a very slow motion kind of phenomenon.
So
How
I
does-
think
how does-
I think the fact that they're still going to international conferences and all the rest, and it looks normal, it looks like it's still sort of a legitimate country. It's sort of somehow part of the family of nations. This is not true. We are in, we're in a Cold War. I mean, I think I said that last year, but now I really feel it much. I think it's more clear. And it doesn't matter who's president. It doesn't matter who wants to recognize this or who wants to say it. It's fairly obvious we're in this Cold War, and we're not going to get out of it very easily.
You mentioned the lack of data that was coming out, and I confess I wasn't familiar with that. What do we know about how the economy is doing? That's always been a dicey area because folks have had to use, for lack of better words, shadow statistics to kind of tease out what really was going on. And when people would figure out one method, that would kind of disappear, and you'd have to come up with another one. Boxcar land. And there's a whole bunch of ones, electricity, and a whole variety of ones. So what you're saying is we really have less information about that.
Energy consumption was a standard way of doing it for a long time, and it often showed that, in fact, the economy was the growth rate of the economy was about half of what they were saying, or maybe 3/4 of what they were saying. And there were a lot of discussions about this. And but the same thing. I mean, with COVID, we have no idea about the numbers, right? We had to start counting funeral urns. Okay, some people started counting cell phone usage. That cell phone usage went way down. The subscriptions went way down. Cell phone subscriptions. I believe that's there's other explanations for that one. That Chinese people are cheap, and if they're all stuck together in an apartment, they'll sort of say, "Well, we'll just use the one cell phone." Right. That's which is kind of an economical, it makes sense. It's one way out of it. But right now, with the economy, we're getting these reports of, a very good growth rate. But it's very, very hard to piece together. And we don't have the energy consumption numbers anymore. And what we have are some trade numbers. But trade is in flux. And it's in flux all over the world. So I think when the pandemic sort of ceases to be a big issue among developed nations, I think then maybe we can get some method of trying to calculate this. But again, I mean, we don't even have anybody on the ground right now. There are some reporters, but these are the reporters who are the supplicants. These are the kowtowing reporters. Okay, they're the ones who don't write the controversial stories. That's why they're still there. So this is the situation. I mean, and one of the reasons I do what I do is I go out and talk to refugees, because refugees from China, if they've come over at least somewhat recently, they can give you information that nobody else can, and they can speak freely, or sometimes they can speak freely. So I think that's the other method, but it's not a fantastic method. It's an okay method. All right, it's very time consuming.
You've done, of course, you've done a great deal of work in the past and continue to do on the human rights issue, particularly on the Uyghurs. Obviously, you were able to, over the years, collect a lot of information. And I guess what I'm hearing is a lot of your sources are, in effect, going dark now.
Yeah, they are. For example, Kazakhstan, where I was before, there were some groups that had formed that were sort of supporting refugees from China, Kazakh refugees, who are also treated just like the Uyghurs, pretty much, and Uyghur refugees. And they, the government, two of them died in custody at different times. Two of the top people, I knew them. They were friends of mine, and one of them died in prison overnight. They said he had a heart attack. Another one died in the hospital because he had COVID, but he wasn't that sick. I mean, it was just this is really serious stuff. China's pulling those strings, not the Kazakh government, not the Russians, not the Kazakh government. They're pulling those strings. That's made it very dangerous and very, very difficult. If there's no counterforce, if you're in basically a one-party state, and there's no freedom of expression or no group they can coalesce behind, people got scared. They can't talk to you really. So I think we're looking at, as I say, we're looking at a very difficult situation on this. But there are still ways around it, and we'll continue to do those.
For our audience, you probably ought to take a step back and provide a context. Obviously, this isn't something that just happened. You've written about it and you've done a lot of research. Yeah. Could you explain what is it about the Uyghurs that have triggered this oppression on the part of the Chinese, the communist Chinese?
I don't know the answer to that exactly, though. The conflicts with China between Uyghurs and the Han Chinese and the Han Chinese empires and so forth goes back to the days of Mulan. I mean, it's long thousands of years ago. In fact, the Uyghurs used to beat the Han Chinese armies quite regularly. And there seems to be a kind of a, people say it's all about Islam or the, Muslims. And the fact is, I know a lot of Uyghurs, and some of them are very, very religious and very dedicated Muslims. A lot of them aren't. A lot of them smoke. A lot of them drink. A lot of them carry on. They're Muslim light. They're Central Asians. It's a kind of relaxed Islam, and so I don't believe it's about that. I believe it's racial. It's a Muslim. These are what is distinctive about the Uyghurs is that they look Caucasian. They are Caucasian. They're Caucasian with somewhat Tartar eyes. It's occasionally an Asian fold, but they are Caucasians. And I think that is a huge issue for the Han Chinese. As China's nationalism has increased, so has its racial, its dedication to the superiority of the Han Chinese race. So that's, I don't want to stress that, but I do base that on some evidence. I mean, one of the interviews I did was with a woman who was raped repeatedly and publicly in the most public ways imaginable. I mean, these stories I had bad dreams about them actually afterwards. And I've come across a lot of bad stories, but this was really unbelievable. And I couldn't help but think when I was talking to her, I sort of said, why are they doing this? And she said, they're animals. Okay, was her answer, right? They're animals. I mean, well, that's race when that's happening. When you're talking about that, even her response is racial. They're animals. They're not human. Well, of course, they dehumanized her. So I do believe it's a lot about that. And of course, then there's a huge economic aspect, which is this is all the energy resources of China, and it's in one area, Xinjiang. It's, that whole region of the world is the new South China Sea. This is where all these resources, yellow cake, uranium, all the uranium mines are in the Pamir Mountains. All the rare metals are in Xinjiang and the Pamir Mountains in Tajikistan. The water can be taken out of the Tibetan Peninsula and attempt to make the desert bloom in Xinjiang. And of course, fracking, massive amounts of fracking that can go on there. So I think there's a real feeling that this is the gold mine, and you don't want these people, or if the people that you do want, are, going to be slaves, just complete slaves, and have no ability to have an uprising of any kind. So I think there are actually may be competing theories about what to do. But I do feel like if China were to get into a war, all these people are going to be killed. It'll be about 13 million, 14 million people. That would be my, if you forced me to take a bet on that, I'd take a bet that that's what will happen. So I think we're really on the edge with this one. We're not only looking at a current human rights catastrophe, but something which could get much, much worse.
That really is a sort of staggering thought going forward. One of the issues that's sort of the red lines on the part of the Chinese government has been, as I understand it, the legitimacy of the Communist Party. That this is an area that others are very reluctant to challenge, official sources are very reluctant to challenge. Could you elaborate just exactly how is that vulnerability, that sensitivity, is that real? Is it how big an issue is it for them?
Well, I mean, they're
not
not
real.
elected.
Right.
They're not elected, and they have studied some history enough to notice that there was these things called the Nuremberg trials. So if they do have a big war, which they seem to be willing to at least risk to achieve their policy objectives,
right.
And if they fail in that war, I think they're very concerned about the outcome of that. Now, at the same time, they saw the fall of the Soviet Union like anybody else, but mostly they saw the fall of Ceausescu, right? When Ceausescu was, basically, firing squad and so forth. I think they worry about that. I think they worry about what happened in Libya to Gaddafi. I think all of those are real concerns. Now, obviously, the biggest concern, or the most immediate concern, if you are a Chinese Communist Party Central Committee member, is of your buddies on the Chinese Central Committee. Those are the ones who are really dangerous to you. That's the immediate danger. But in the long term, they are concerned about that. And so I think a lot of the paranoia is based on that. I think that, if you had an economy that was actually starting to bring prosperity to a lot of people, some prosperity, or enough so that they had some money in their pockets, I think the obvious thing that, American businessmen have been saying for years is somewhat true. It's like if you give people some money, at some point they're going to start demanding a little bit of freedom or security with that money, right? They're going to want some guarantees. They're not just going to want to buy property in the Midwest or these kinds of things that people do to try to get the money out of China and make it secure. But that really hasn't happened. The Chinese Communist Party has doubled down. And I don't know what to say about that beyond that that's how communism works. But there's one other factor that I mentioned that I think is very important. And you see this in the Soviet Union and you see it in China. The tendency is you take a group, Tiananmen Square, Cultural Revolution, something like that. You kill a lot of people, and then suddenly you have all these skeletons in the closet. And you never want people to look in that closet. So then you start getting rid of people who know about the closet, right? And any maps or pictures of the closet, you make sure that people can't go there. This is something you see in China very clearly, and it's the same thing we saw in the Soviet Union. What happened? Stalin started killing the kulaks in Ukraine, so he was just killing very rich peasants. But then he had to kill the people who knew about the killing of the kulaks. So there's always a multiplier on this, and that multiplier is what drives the Communist Party. And it also means they want to change the subject and pick out new enemies every time. It's a really sick, vicious cycle. Okay. They never get off this merry-go-round. So, and we're seeing that now.
So one of the challenges that China does have going forward is this demographic sort of baby bust that has taken place as a result of the one-child policy that has been, they're changing it now, but before it's a little, demographics being a little like a ocean liner or a aircraft carrier, it takes decades to turn around. So the workforce is now declining. The people working age is declining, and that, as I understand it, is expected to have some impact on what their growth rate is and what it used to happen with folks coming in from the farms in the city and getting higher paying jobs and producing more. Sort of that phenomena has slowed down. Is that a fair thesis?
I think that's very fair, and I think the implications of that are pretty obvious. It's going to it will have a dramatic impact on that economy. Even while they are turning it around, which they are, as you pointed out, like the big aircraft carrier, they're slowly turning it around, except for populations they don't want, like the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, the Hui, Mongolians, the groups, and Tibetans, obviously. They don't want these people breeding at all, or very little. So one of the things we were interested in the beginning with when we started looking into slave labor in China, I said, well, maybe this is like the Old South. I mean, plantation owners wanted slaves to breed a little bit because it's like getting a new car. Okay, something. You got a new car. You got a new car. You got to maintain it a little bit, but it's worth it. It's gonna put you in better shape. I don't think that's happening here. What we see, all the evidence is pointing to women getting their tubes tied, and tied in a way that it's not tied; they're cut. They can never have children again. And all the evidence of forced labor seems to be that these women are sent off when they're about 18, and they're released from the factory that they're working at when they're about 45, which is too late to have a baby.
So really, it is genocide and just depopulation
slow motion.
of those. Yeah.
Slow motion, somewhat deferred genocide. Yeah. I guess, I mean, everybody loves to argue about that term, but genocide doesn't have to happen all at once. Again, in a war, I think we'd see it happen very quickly. I think we'd see a speed up of these processes. But that's a theory. I can't prove that. I've never seen plans that say that. I mean, people have looked around and sort of said, can we find a final solution plan? No, you're not going to find that. Okay, the Chinese are not stupid. They're not going to put these documents out there. So I think all of those, but you're right that this is going. Businesses have shown, American businesses and so forth, that they're willing to look at Indonesia and willing to look at India. So
that is actually another issue we could talk about, is that relationship of American business that has looked to China, and some of the how shall I say, strongest Chinese apologists have been in the business community. It became dependent, and they looked to China as being part of their supply chain. And as you mentioned, there's been evidence that a number of companies have backed away from it. Although some of it is that the cost advantage, as I understand it, some of it is that the cost advantage that China used to enjoy, the so-called China price, doesn't really exist. I mean, they are now competitive with our other countries are every bit as competitive with them, and so the diversification of the supply chain makes a fair amount of sense. So that could be.
Well, yeah, and it used to be that, as somebody who did business in China, I can tell you it was a pretty good environment compared to Indonesia or India initially, because you could get things done in a way in China that you couldn't. You had layers of bureaucracy in India. Indonesia was so many cultural barriers that you had to work through. China seemed downright good for business. That's really changed. And I knew when it changed, because the Mormons are the #1 business group of Americans in Beijing, right? Because the Mormons go over and they proselytize. They proselytize in Taiwan and so forth. And they learn some of the language, and they're good at learning languages. And then they say, well, hey, I could apply this in business in China. So they do. And they're awfully good businessmen too. And I used to go to their prayer breakfasts sometimes. I was actually one of the few outsiders that was invited. It was a big honor I got to know them very well. And I trust their views of business in China, or at least how easy it is or how hard it is to do. And it was very interesting when Romney suddenly started rejecting business in China. And he was clearly going, and there were certain signals that he was obviously going off his buddies in Beijing who were telling him it's terrible here now, right? So I think the business environment has changed dramatically at this point for foreign companies. Now, not all foreign companies, and there's a new one born every minute. Okay, so it's somebody who jumps over there and gets the China dream and wants to get in there, and we see that again and again. But most of them have come up against a basically Communist Party culture, which always favors the Chinese company. It always favors counterfeiting. Doesn't matter what they say about it. They do favor Chinese companies just doing straight imitations and then surpassing them. Happens all the time. And we're going to continue to see that, I think. And there's no clear sign that there's been a significant change in that culture.
That seems to be built in. I know a number of companies that have expressed problems that, product lines would be the manufacturing, and then clearly knockoffs were being produced literally with the same equipment, the same factory, and then sold into the market. And that was obviously a breach of the agreement, but that really didn't matter. That was an opportunity to make money.
Look, I think there are always success stories in China, but the continuity of this over time is quite the most impressive thing. And it has definitely gotten worse. Just wanted to, and the other thing is that China has realized its strengths. So they're trying to become manufacturers who actually use those rare earth minerals and so forth. So they don't want to be dependent on chip manufacturers in Taiwan. They want to do it all themselves. But we'll see. I mean, I'm a little bit optimistic that the business community has learned some things over time. Unfortunately, that's not true of places, like the medical community. The medical community still considers China the future, and they have to be very polite to China, and they're very frightened of doing anything to offend them. And that's a disaster because of we know that they're doing organ harvesting on a fairly large scale every year. And obviously, the medical world shouldn't be touching them with a 10-foot pole. And I thought COVID would have signaled that pretty accurately too, but apparently it has not done that. So the naivete of that particular community is phenomenal.
That seems to be a good word, is the naivete. But of course, there's a cross current of interests. So many individuals have their own relationships with China that the Chinese,
that's right,
at least anecdotally, have been able to play that. If you want to, I think we talked last year, the issue for many China scholars, if you want to get allowed back into China, you got to temper a little bit of what you say. I think of one author who used to be on the good list, who switched to the bad list, and talked about the difference in the experience that he had. I'm assuming when was the last time they let you into China?
Oh, 2002.
It's been a while.
They banned me around 2005. I mean, I kind of tested that,
Right.
I discreetly tested that. Now I could probably, argue to go there or something, but it's really pointless because anybody I talk to that I actually want to talk to, I'll get them in deep trouble.
Right.
It's a surveillance society, so I don't feel like I have to go out and do the dramatic flourish in this. Sorry, that was right out of our vice president's book, wasn't it? The dramatic flourish of going to the border. But it does feel a little bit that way to me because I'm not really very impressed with what journalists have learned on the ground in China in recent years. So, for example, the concentration camps in Xinjiang. And they came back, the BBC came back with all these pictures of people dancing, girls dancing. Concentration camps, and they said, "Oh, this is actual footage from them." Well, no, it's footage that's put on for you. And they said, "Well, look, this guy has a black eye." I said, "The audience didn't see that. You think you're making this very subtle point. It's like you're not. The Chinese see you coming, and they're putting on an image that that people will remember, which is girls twisting and turning. Give me a break, right?" So I'm not. I think there are other ways to get at information that don't kill people. I mean, somebody on the ground in China, God bless them, they should, I hope they're successful, but it's very unlikely.
So Ethan, I work in the IT field, so my interest in China is mostly on their technological prowess and how they kind of dominate the IT industry in terms of like what you said before, how they will take a product, they're asked to manufacture this product. They take the specs with it, they manufacture it, but then they keep a copy of the specs and they have something that they use internally. So that's one problem. The IP, theft problem has been known for a while. I mean, classic example is the Cisco switches and routers. These are the infrastructure systems we use for the internet, and they just basically, wholesale copied those system designs. To touch back a little bit on the rare earth bit, the thing that concerns me the most is that China has truly a monopoly on rare earth materials. At one point, they were the only ones who would dig them up, but they had let other countries process them. So other countries could actually manufacture, the magnets, the neodymium magnets, and those kind of things that are needed for, like alternative energy, motors and those kind of things. But now, they have taken that inside too. And so, if you want to get any kind of rare earth, magnet or anything, it's got to go through China. And so, that to me is a big concern, because we only have one place to go to for that. And the U.S. policy, the atomic policy, pretty much keeps us from harvesting the same kind of materials, because we actually could harvest them. Yeah. The issue is that they're typically found with like thorium deposits, and the Nuclear Regulatory Agency classifies thorium as like a nuclear product, and so they won't let people separate the thorium from the rare earth materials and process them. So we can only go to China to have that processed. And again, they control the market at that point. So if they want to put pressure on us, if we put pressure on them and say, hey, we think this is unfair dealing, they can squeeze us just as hard, because we don't have any alternative sources for that.
I thought that was sort of cleared up after they threatened Japan. China threatened to cut off all rare earths to Japan at one point. And I thought that there was a move towards a strategic reserve or changing that policy, but you're telling me that really hasn't been fixed at all.
Not what I've seen. I mean, it may be possible, but everything that I've read is that China has basically insisted that if you want to use their materials, they also have to process it. There may be some additional processing that's done after China, manufactures the magnets. There may be some assembly that's done in Japan, but I think the actual processing, both the mining and the processing of the magnets, is done exclusively in China.
Well, I think it's really, personally, should I say what I really think? Which is this is the great game, okay? This is the great game all over again. And it's all going to come down to Central Asia, because this is where those other materials are. They're not in China, but they're in places in Central Asia, like the Pamir Mountains and so forth, that are hard, in Kyrgyzstan, obviously. And they're hard to get to, and they'd require some real investment on our side, but I think that's worth doing.
I was interested in your comments about the Belt and Road Initiative and the pushback that you said that was taking place in some countries. Can you elaborate as to kind of what the source of that is? I've read some stuff, but it's been fascinating that you would think that
Well, look, maybe I'm being a little optimistic here, okay? Because I was very excited when they started tearing down the surveillance towers in Hong Kong too. I thought that was like a great moment. It turned out it was just a little fun along the way towards dictatorship, towards a complete dictatorial control. But having said that, there are examples of this, and the European countries who were sort of betting on the Belt and Road Initiative. It hasn't worked out very well. Part of that was the pandemic and COVID, but also a lot of them tried to get a hold of Sinovac, the Chinese vaccine, right? Now, it turns out that Sputnik, to everybody's surprise, Sputnik's actually a very effective vaccine. It's on the level of AstraZeneca or Moderna. It's maybe not as effective as Pfizer, but it's up there, right? Sinovac is not. It's like 50%, maybe, right? And a lot of countries which were relying on Sinovac exclusively have been spiraling back into at least a lot of cases of COVID-19. So I think that the reward system of the Belt and Road Initiative hasn't been working out very well. The other problem, of course, is that it's very similar to the Soviet Union. You basically start getting all these countries, you get all these countries on your side, and you start financing things, and you build facilities, and those facilities need maintenance and so forth. And you hire people, and then it starts unraveling, because these countries are kind of basket cases, and they're not intending to pay you back that money, whatever money you put in. And you could say, well, that's okay because we get to seize this port here, or that's based, this spot here. And, I don't know. Did that do the Soviet Union that many favors? Maybe in Cuba. Maybe Cuba really scared us for a while and was a real threat. But
it cost the Soviets a lot of money.
it cost the Soviets a lot of money. In some ways, you could say it drove them down it drove their economy to the brink. I mean, Cuba was maybe it was the jewel in the crown, but it was an incredibly expensive jewel near the end. I mean, they were, I don't remember the exact figures, but at the end of the Soviet Union, it was eating up just, basically they were supporting the entire economy. Nobody was doing any work. So I'm not saying that's happening all over in all these Belt and Road Initiative countries. It's not. But even in the ones where it's supposedly kind of successful, like Pakistan, it's way behind schedule. Look, I've been on a lot of those roads, okay? I've driven those roads. I've driven on those roads when they were icy, okay? In Kazakhstan. And they're not there. They're in terrible shape, okay? They're missing huge sections. All I can say is when I got to Russia, when I crossed the border into Russia, I was like, hallelujah, thank God for Putin. The roads are plowed, okay? Okay, that's how I felt. So don't color me unimpressed, okay, by a lot of that, of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think it's fair to say that we should have some competitive system. I think that's a perfectly fair thing to say. But to just say it's going to dominate everything and this is a big success, it is not. It's probably going to cost the Chinese a tremendous amount of money. And at some point, there's going to be some resentment about that in China domestically.
Now, I've read that there's resentment because it's sort of a more sort of economically contained investment. So the investment's back with Chinese companies and locals are not as involved and it's not as big a generator locally, and that's created its own resentment. So it's not kickstarting trade, but it's kind of a very much funneled into the sort of Chinese interest.
But the final aspect is racial. I mean, the Chinese don't even like these people. They make fun of these people in their shows. They make fun of Africa and how primitive it is and so forth. I mean, so that's a problem too. I mean, the one thing that you could say about the Soviet Union as a communist state, it was economically very ineffective, but it was not a racial appeal that they were projecting. They were projecting a system that's, to a lot of countries, which felt like they weren't doing very well, seemed like a better system, something, or at least a possibility of change, right? The Chinese aren't, I think the beginnings of the clash, I mean, we're talking such macro levels here, but the beginning of the clash between the Chinese nationalism, which is really racial nationalism, and communism, you're starting to see an actual clash. It makes it difficult for China to spread their wonderful system. It was fine when they just said, countries ought to be authoritarian and they ought to be left alone by the world, right, to do whatever they need to do internally. That's a message that's very popular to dictators.
It raises a question about what Chinese domination is intended to look like, since
that's right.
They're not, unlike the Soviets that imagined a system that was global in nature, obviously perhaps with Russian or Soviet tanks available when necessary to come rolling in. The Chinese have not had, it's tough for them to have those kind of aspirations because they're very much tied to their own locale and their own nationality.
Yeah, I think they've sort of boxed themselves into a corner in this. But again, I'm probably being kind of optimistic. I have a tendency to think that way. I'm looking for the weak. Look, guys, I'm probing the weaknesses here. I'm looking for the weaknesses in this.
There you go. Yeah. So you're off to Taiwan. As sort of a final question, a year from now, what do you expect? Do you anticipate any surprises or anything that we should be looking for in the future?
I think I'm headed to exactly the right place to answer that question. I think how Taiwan goes is going to tell us a lot. It's going to be really interesting to see if the Biden administration has its sort of sister soldier moment, or the moment where they sort of take some aircraft carriers and put them in the Taiwan Strait. I mean, this is the question: is when do they make that show of force, and do they? This is the problem. Is this area, Taiwan, is not something Congress can really do as much about. Okay, it's this is an area. This is the prerogative of the administration. So I must admit I was not completely secure about Trump's dedication to defending Taiwan either. But I really believed in Pompeo on that. Okay, I believe Pompeo really meant it. He's a true friend of Taiwan. And if we let the only Taiwan, the only Chinese democracy in the world die, this is a disaster. And it's one thing with Hong Kong, but and it was the British let it happen, and maybe they should have put up more of a fight. We can argue about that, but this one's our responsibility. This is ours.
Well, we look forward.
Yeah,
we look forward to having you back and hearing how things come from that side of the world. So when we have the show, as we were talking before, it'll be a breakfast show for you, but that's okay. So we look forward to having you back. But we're glad that we're able to return again this year. So
no, it's great to be it's great to be back here on this show. I love being back here. So
thank you very much.
Look forward to it. Cheers. Bye now.